Good morning, everybody. I'm back again, Disrupting Violence vlog. And I do this on behalf of Violence Prevention Agency. And today we want to talk about systemic violence. Now, in episode 1, I touched on how messy and how complicated and how highly contested violence is. But we're going to continue now with the discussion, and I want to look at systemic violence. Because you see, violence comes in different forms and types. And so we get direct and indirect violence. And direct violence is your physical violence type. Your rape, your organized crime, your hate crime, your domestic violence, your intimate partner violence. That's all physical and it's direct, you can see it. So sometimes people also talk about visible and invisible violence. Now, we're all accustomed to physical violence. We all know about physical violence because we can see it. It's very direct. It's not invisible. You can see it. What many people don't understand is that there's a connection between indirect violence or invisible violence. We're going to talk later about that. But I want to come back to the different forms. Indirect, direct. Invisible, visible. Illegitimate, legitimate. So I can understand when people say they're lekker confused. They are quite confused with understanding violence and why people constantly saying, but violence is normalized. So we're going to talk also a little bit about that. But I want to come back to systemic violence because that is what is affecting most of us in the lockdown and in dealing with COVID-19. You see, systemic violence is when the system disappoints us, when the system creates violence. So very often then we want to say that violence is about people. People are violent. People are the perpetrators of violence. But we never consider that institutions, policies, workplaces, the travel system, that those institutions, those entities, those structures are also violent, and hence systemic violence. Let me give you a few examples. We look at the lockdown and we say we are all affected, regardless of your race and regardless of your economic status, whether you're working or not, we all affected. But how are we affected? How are we affected in the same way and differently? So from a systemic point of view, if you are staying in a situation where it's not an informal house, or you are homeless. That's a form of systemic violence, because where are the housing that was promised to people? That would be systemic. Perhaps another example is our railway system. We can't get onto the train because it's overcrowded. Our safety is compromised. So that's a systemic challenge. Another one that's perhaps close to our hearts is the food distribution that is happening in all our communities. Another form of systemic violence, when we haven't catered for the huge group that needs to get, when we don't deal with food distribution from a policy point of view, then that would be a form of systemic violence. And so if we want to go further and connect it with physical violence, then perhaps a good example would be where people are given, your distribution points and your cans are given food to distribute. And they send that to the distribution point. And then the food doesn't really reach the people that need to get it. Now, we would view that as physical violence. We would see it as corruption. But what has driven that? So that's where the systemic violence comes in. Because the system fails us in terms of how food must be distributed, how it must be monitored, etc., etc. We are also busy in feeding those who need it, that those things are just beyond us at this point in time. So we wait and wait and wait until there's a major disruption. Because now people who got food no longer get food, it's not sustainable, and nou is hulle kwaad. Now they're angry, they're upset, they're aggressive. And so then what does that do? People go out, and we all know the word scarrel. In English, it's scouting out, people who go out and then they need to go and look for something to eat. And that is when crime increases. So systemic violence is extremely important for us to know, how do we tackle not the small fish, but the bigger fish. Now, because of lockdown, I can't go out here. But when you look at my home, groot huis, middle class house, 5 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, swimming pool, and the picture that people have is of wealth. But where am I standing now? In what neighborhood am I in? And I'm in a retreat. I'm 5 minutes away from the railway station, where the Department of Health sent their ambulances and their health workers to come and do testing here. Because the taxi rank is also there, and people were found to be positive. But in this side of retreat, I don't hear gunshots. And I don't have people living in bungalows in my home here, but I'm still in retreat. So what is the systemic violence then attached to this? What is the structural violence attached to this? And this is it. A few years ago, I couldn't live here. I couldn't live here during apartheid. This was a pocket of houses that the railway built for poor whites. And in the early 90s, when CODESA was happening, people started to open up the sale of these houses. And that's how a number of people got to get these houses. So systemic violence prevented us from coming to stay here. Nou, ek weet mos, I know, man. You are going to be listening to this video, watching it, and then you're going to say, ach, but that's in the past. Why are you picking up again on that? Because the past is very much present. Why do I live now in this middle class house, in a middle class community? But around the corner, my neighbors on the other side of the railway, they're not living like that. So the lack of housing, the overcrowded housing complicates the implementation of lockdown. How can you self-isolate when your house is packed to capacity? How can you stay in your house when you do shifts for sleeping because you're so many people? So some people must go out so that the others can sleep. And then they must go out again when they wake up so that the rest can sleep. This is systemic violence. But what we do is we put blame on ourselves, on people who are poor, disadvantaged. We call them lazy, and we call them williewerkers, people who don't want to work. And on the other hand, our people will say, but the refugees and the asylum seekers and the foreigners and the Chinese, they are taking up all our work. So the point I'm wanting to make is how violence is deeply connected. So physical violence doesn't stand on its own. Physical violence is connected to other invisible forms of violence. Now let's take Courtney Peters. Courtney Peters was murdered by someone who stayed in her home with her parents, a boarder. And Courtney's mom went to work on the day that Courtney disappeared, and later her body was found. Everybody blamed Courtney's mother for not taking care of Courtney. But nobody asked, where were you? Because then you would have heard the mother was working. Nobody asked, now why did you leave your child alone? Because the father was there and the boarder was there. Nobody asked the question, so you work at night and this is a legitimate job, so now don't your bosses give you people aftercare? No, they'll never do that. Yeah, but that's the norm in a lot of countries. So the point I'm wanting to make is how violence is deeply connected to other invisible forms of violence. So physical violence is connected to other invisible forms of violence. If you're a worker, you can get access to childcare, and sometimes childcare happens at night because you're a night shift worker. So those are forms of systemic violence. Systemic violence is when the system lets us down. Whether the system is an institution, whether it is a school, whether it is policy, whether it is our Chapter 9 organizations like the Human Rights Commission or the Gender Commission for Gender Equality. Doesn't matter what Chapter 9 organizations we have. Systemic violence comes when systems and policies and fail us. We bring out wonderful national plans of action against gender-based violence. We sit and we consult and we develop these wonderful national plans. En omkom van die boom, when we really need to implement those plans, then there's no resources, there's no funding, there's limited funding, limited resources, and you as an NGO, and you as an emerging structure, and you working in the community, you might get whatever you need to implement. That is also systemic violence. So we don't always understand the interconnectedness between different forms and types of violence. We don't understand that. We are taken aback, we mourn, we protest when a woman is murdered. We stand at the courts as we should rightfully, and we call for justice. And in Violence Prevention Agency, we are asking, and what more? Because this is a systemic problem. Yes, we know. There's a physicality of it. Somebody was raped and murdered and horribly violated. But in a country where we have gender-based violence policies, where we have legislation around it, where we have a national plan of action, why isn't it reducing? So that is systemic violence. Why during the lockdown are we seeing an increase of intimate partner violence, to the extent that we can't even find place in a shelter for these women? What is it saying about our systems? We focus on the woman that's going through the crisis, and rightfully so. We should. We focus on the children. But how do we prevent this violence from continuing? Year in, year out, week in, week out, daily. How do we really capture that? And so I want to come back to say it starts with us. It starts with human agency. It starts with us beginning to revisit, reflect on our thinking around violence. And it also means that we need to begin to think through practical, implementable interventions that will reduce gender-based violence in our country. Because nobody tells you that gender-based violence plays a huge role in the lack of economic growth in our country, as many other forms of violence does. But we only view it in a physical violence from a physical violence point of view. And I'm wanting to say that it's far more complex than that. So let's talk about this. Kan ons nou, I know net die funding kry and we don't really talk about what are the challenges. So let me stop there. Bye-bye, see you tomorrow.